You think you know the story of the American Revolution, but what if that whole famous protest over taxes, what if it was just a cover for something else? Something a little more profitable. Let's peel back some of those myths and see what really lit the fuse for independence.
I mean, we all know the slogan, right? No taxation without representation. The story we learn in school is that the colonists were just fed up with crazy high taxes from Britain. But honestly, was that the whole story?
Oh, not even close. The idea that this whole thing was just about the price of tea, well, it misses the much bigger and, frankly, much more interesting picture. See, the real fight wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about principles. The taxes were just the flashpoint for a way deeper struggle over who had the power, and believe it or not, over a colonial tradition that Britain suddenly decided it wanted to crush. So the colonists were furious for two big reasons. First, yeah, they had absolutely no voice in the government that was taxing them. But second, and this is the big one, Britain started cracking down hard on smuggling, a practice that had been the profitable, kinda illegal backbone of the colonial economy for 100 years. So why the sudden crackdown? Why the need for all this cash? Well, it all goes back to the 7 Years' War. It left Britain with a debt that is just staggering to think about, £150 million. So from London's point of view, it seemed totally fair that the American colonies, who definitely benefited from the war, should help pay it all off.
Okay, and this is super important to understand. For years, the colonists were used to the old taxes. Those were just about regulating trade inside the British Empire. They didn't love them, but they mostly just smuggled their way around them. No big deal. But these new taxes, they were totally different. Their only purpose was to raise money directly for Britain. And to the colonists, it felt like Britain was just changing the rules of the game halfway through. This new way of doing things kicked off a really nasty cycle. Britain would pass some new act, the colonists would protest like crazy, Britain would sort of back down, but then they'd try something else. And each time, the tension just got ratcheted up another notch. And this escalation happened so fast. I mean, look at this. Within just one decade, you get this rapid-fire series of acts. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and finally, the infamous Tea Act. Each one of these just added another log to a growing fire. Now, the Stamp Act of 1765, this one was a real game changer. It was a direct tax on all paper products. And who uses the most paper? You guessed it, lawyers, printers, newspaper publishers, basically the most influential and loudest people in the colonies. Probably not the best group to make angry. And because of that, the Stamp Act sparked the first big, coordinated, colony-wide response. You had the Stamp Act Congress organizing boycotts. You had groups like the Sons of Liberty taking the protests right to the streets. For the very first time, the colonies were starting to act like a single unit. And hey, the protests worked. Parliament actually repealed the Stamp Act. But they weren't done trying. The Townshend Acts came just 2 years later, and they not only slapped on new taxes, but also created a special customs board with one job: crush the colonists' beloved smuggling operations. So the resistance fired right back up again, and this time it got even bigger. Women organized as the Daughters of Liberty, making their own homespun cloth to replace all the boycotted British goods. The movement was getting broader, more popular, and way more confrontational. And, well, inevitably, things turned violent. The Boston Massacre is a perfect example of how perception becomes reality. 5 colonists were killed in a chaotic street confrontation, but it was hardly a massacre. And here's a fascinating twist. The British soldiers were actually defended in court by the future president and patriot, John Adams. Which brings us to the Boston Tea Party. And here's the surprising thing. The Tea Act actually lowered the price of legal tea. But the colonists weren't angry about the cost. They were furious about the principle. By dumping the equivalent of $4 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor, they were sending a crystal clear message. Britain could not tax them without their consent, period. The Tea Party was a direct, in-your-face challenge to British authority, and Britain's response was so harsh, so severe, that it pushed the colonies from just being organized protesters to actually forming their own alternative government. Britain's answer was a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. I mean, the name says it all. These acts shut down self-government in Massachusetts, forced regular people to let British soldiers live in their homes, and this was a huge deal for the very Protestant colonists. It extended rights to Catholics in Quebec. To them, this was a full-on assault on their liberty.
That was the final straw. In response, delegates from 12 of the colonies met for the First Continental Congress. And this was the truly revolutionary step. It wasn't a protest group anymore. This was the first de facto government of America.
But there was still one more piece of the puzzle missing. All these protests were about securing their rights as Englishmen. The final, crucial transformation was an ideological one, a shift in thinking that turned a fight over taxes and representation into a fight for the natural rights of all humanity. And this was a profound change. You see, the colonists stopped arguing for their traditional rights as English subjects and started claiming universal, natural rights simply as human beings. This was the intellectual rocket fuel they needed to declare independence.
And nobody captured this new way of thinking better than Thomas Paine in his pamphlet, Common Sense. He just cut through all the complicated legal arguments with powerful, straightforward logic. Think about it. How can a tiny island possibly rule a massive continent forever? It's just common sense. The impact was absolutely explosive. Common Sense sold 150,000 copies in just a few months. It was read aloud in taverns and on street corners, and it convinced countless regular people that the only logical path forward was complete and total independence. So, to bring this all together, it's really important to see that the American Revolution and the American War for Independence are not the same thing. The Revolution was the change in thinking, the revolution of the mind that happened all through the 1760s and 70s. The war was the armed conflict that started in 1775. First came the revolution of ideas, then came the War of Swords. So in the end, the story of the American Revolution is really about how smuggling and boycotts and protests over principles finally merged with a radical new idea of liberty. And it leaves us with a pretty critical question, one that echoes through history. At what point does an idea become powerful enough to start a war?